All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the session on Back to the Future. A little bit of a reverb here. Back to the Future on ESSA's effect on innovation. And my name is John Kim.
That was me. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
I'll behave.
My name is John Kim. I'm a faculty member at Harvard Business School, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Robert New, who is the Superintendent of Oklahoma City. We have Shilpi Niyogi. She is the Senior Vice President of North America Corporate Affairs and Global Government Relations at Pearson. Jean Kerns, Chief Academic Officer of Renaissance Learning. And Scott Kinney, Senior Vice President of Educational Partnerships at Discovery Education. So very pleased to be here. We have about 50 minutes, and the way we're going to conduct this is I'm going to set this up. And for those of you who know something about Harvard Business School, is that the instructor does about 10% of the talking, and they're going to do about 90% of the talking, and I'm going to try to do that. And number two is that in order to make this panel to be interesting, we're going to try to make it a little bit lively. I think a lot of the learning happens when we're not all agreeing with each other, but that we're really exploring the edges of disagreements. And sometimes I'll even exaggerate people's position just to give you a heads up, just to make it a little bit interesting. It doesn't mean that I believe it or that they believe it, but I might even throw some words into their mouths and stuff like that. Okay, just so you know. And I've warned them. We're going to be friends all along. And
we'll see.
We'll see. You'll let me know. Yesterday, one of the panelists says, "I feel like I'm being interrogated," and I said, "Well, that's what moderation is, But anyway, so we're here at this conference on innovation, and all of you must be like policy junkies because you're here talking about ESSA. But if you really think about it, given the fact that so much of our largest customer is the government. And for those of you who are in the session this morning with Jim Collins and talking about what can you control or what can't you control, the legislations of something like this can have a profound effect and change. And here what we want to really explore is what are the effects that it can have on innovation. And just as a very high-level highlight, what I just thought would be helpful is to say for the Every Student Succeeds Act, we are going to keep the annual testing requirements, and the subgroup performance must still be reported individually, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the big change I think that everybody has been talking about is it increases state autonomy. It really kind of pushes it back to the states. And in some ways, I think it decreases the federal role in this education, or maybe not. I mean, those are kinds of things I think we should talk about, and how does it change? And also, does it affect the stakes involved with testing? And so those are kind of the areas that I want to explore with each of you. So I think where we want to start is I wanted to ask an opening question to each of you. And that question is ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, is this good for innovation? Is this good? What is your assessment of it? And who is it good for? And your answer cannot be, it's too early to tell. Or it can't be, it depends. Okay, because when we do this at a Harvard Business School classroom, that's when we mark those comments down. So tell us, and Robert, why don't we start with you? Because you're on the receiving end of this right now. So tell us.
Well, I think it depends, and it's too early to tell.
I'd like to support Robert's answer.
Yeah, I want to build on that. That's another good one. I want to really build on that answer. No, Robert, tell us really. Come on. This is you actually, I should have said, have not only your current role now, but I know that you've served in Washington State as well as in Michigan. So you, in fact, have more of a multi-state perspective. But what's your sense?
Well, I think that ultimately it's going to be good for kids. First and foremost, the loosening of the focus on the test result And I say that singular because we've had this singular focus on the test, and we've been teaching to the test. We've put in place pacing guides to get kids ready to perform on the test. We've put teacher accountability tied to the test. And so even though we're still testing, which I struggle with, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but at least there's other measures that can now be brought into play. So my hope is that we'll loosen some of the constraints and the fear that teachers are dealing with on a daily basis that transcends or that directly impacts the instruction that what the kids are feeling. So hopefully the winners are the kids.
And the adults in the district, they've welcomed this. Is that what am I taking away from this, or it's been mixed?
I think so. I mean, you know, how many years have we been waiting for this?
Yeah.
And so the fact that something has happened, I think that there's a little bit of a celebration out there. But it truly is too early to tell, in the sense that the devil's in the details. And I'll finish with this and let my teammates speak. We have built this culture of compliance based on the test for 14 years now. And I'm telling you, the fear out there is intense. And teachers are absolutely scared to death to not have kids perform on the test. And so it's going to take time to reculture American schools, to get out of that mindset and to really get back into teaching kids and going deep into learning.
Okay, great.
I would just pick up on the last thing you said. I mean, you know, as a parent, so I have 3 children in middle school who, over the last 2 weeks, have been taking the Pennsylvania state assessments, and they have shut down. I mean, they've spent now 2 weeks taking the state exams, and it has very little to do with instruction at this point. And I think to your point of that culture, what we've seen is kind of this building, right? So it's not just this 2 weeks, but now we have interim assessments that are building towards making sure that we can pass the summative assessment. We have benchmark assessments, and it has snowballed upon itself. So I think, you know, the great hope here with the ESSA, and I would say, you know, the door is there. It's up to us as an educational community to open that door and walk through it and take advantage of some of the things that are in there. But the great hope is that we can start to blend those things and say, you know, how smart can we get around formative assessment, and how far can we take that opportunity to take formative assessment into a summative evaluation, and for companies like us, how do we begin to integrate that in a fashion that really, really makes sense, so that there is no stopping and assessment becomes this event that you do for 2 weeks, but it truly is part of that instructional process.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things is they're going to limit the amount of time. There's going to be some sort of a limitation on the amount of time that students are in these tests. So, to that point. What about other views?
Yeah, I think Rob sounds a little bit more enthusiastic than I am. I think we're moving to a better place, without question. Clearly, there is an intent from Congress that this reinvigorate the profession, that this reinvigorate creativity. I think there are several things we have to think about. One is, if we're going to innovate under this new legislation, where is the power going to rest? So clearly, we've moved from the feds to more power at the state level. Is that going to stay in the State House? Or is that going to go down to the district level? And is that going to go down to the teacher level? Because really, to me, innovation is going to be on the front lines there. We don't have a sense for where the power is going to rest. And even last week, we saw tension between Lamar Alexander and the U.S. Department of Education in sessions about guidance that they were giving about how to respond to this law that he felt was overreaching. So clearly, at least from Congress's standpoint, they want to get the power out of Washington and back to the states. Even then, U.S. DOE is wrestling with that somewhat. And then the question is, even if it makes it out of Washington, does it make it to the district? Does it make it to the school level? But I want to echo something that Rob said, because I think is so important. It was a long time coming for this reauthorization. So we have educators who have spent nearly a decade and a half under No Child Left Behind with the accountability requirements. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're afraid, if you're looking for shelter or food, you don't think about the self-actualization stuff. And unfortunately, recently, we've created fear on the part of many teachers for their jobs. They are afraid to step off of the pacing guide or to innovate in certain ways. So just because with a swipe of a pen we've changed things from a regulatory or legislative standpoint, I don't think we realize how long it's going to take people to realize that they have some freedoms, even if that freedom comes to the classroom level. So it's a huge mind shift for teachers to realize wow, I might actually be able to innovate again and do so without fear, because they've been living with fear.
You're basically saying they may not even take advantage of
I think in the short term,
yeah.
it's, and we even see that with the states now. There's a handful of states as early adopters who have already put forth their plans, but even the states most of them are sitting back and saying, well, let me wait and see what happens with those first couple of folks charging in.
A good friend of mine, Peter Gorman, who used to run a school district in Charlotte, and he used to always say, it's a little bit like free-range chicken. If they've been cooped up all day, you open the door, they just stay in the cage. They don't actually leave.
Yeah.
So, but
I just want to jump in real
ahead.
quick. I'm telling you firsthand, they're scared to death out there still.
Who's they?
Teachers,
Teachers
principals, superintendents, board members, you name it, everyone throughout the system. And I will say, to your point about now the states having control, I lose my enthusiasm when I think about legislators being involved in this process.
Let's get Shilpi in the conversation. What's your sense?
So I am afraid I'm going to build on a lot of what I heard, but I
Boy, you guys all are agreeing now.
But I think the big takeaway starts with where Rob started us in talking about this is about the kids, and this really is about, are we going to make things better for most of our students? And I think we can't forget the historic kind of what's this law really all about and what's it always been about, which is, are we really making sure all our kids are getting access to a high quality education, and at a time when the competitiveness for jobs and the innovation conversation is as much about where do we as a country, where do we as a community stand in kind of really realizing what we can accomplish and kind of the American dream being something that's really out there for all of our kids. I think the equity piece is a bigger deal, and I think the opportunity here and what was really encouraging in listening to this panel is we are talking about we. Not us and them, not you versus me, not this district versus that district, not teachers versus administrators. I think that's the huge opportunity, and if we win, it's going to be because we really do think about this as we, and I think that's the way we start to counter the fear, because there's kind of been this sense that there's a blame game in education rather than shared accountability or shared responsibility. And I'm hoping what this law does for all of us is give us a reset, right? A chance to really rethink, what's my piece of this? How do I need to show up? What's the responsibility I have as part of the education community?
Okay. So since the four of you are so agreeable, maybe I'll have to at least propose some of the opposing arguments. One is that, Jean, you talked about essentially saying, hey, look, now we're going to give people creativity. We're going to shift the balance of power from a central body to more distributed. But it could also be taken that you're just going to get variation. And if you just get variation and you go to different, and I'll take probably a terrible example, but if you go to a restaurant trying to all achieve the same thing, and each restaurant serves you something different, and you don't know what you're going to get, it's not necessarily better. That all you're doing is just injecting lots of variation, some of which may be better and some of which may be worse. What do you say to that? I mean, you even said, hey, I don't know if I actually like the fact that the power has now shifted to the state legislature. So what do you all say to that? How do you counter that argument?
Well, I think, because one thing, as you noted, annual testing is still in place. And I think you brought up a very valid point, Shilpi, that particularly for the subgroup piece, I mean, that was strongly advocated for by groups who represent underprivileged children in many instances. And clearly there's data to support that for many kids in need, performance has gone up. And so that's why those two pieces are in there. So in some sense, I see the annual testing as still as the control piece that says, okay, well, let's innovate, but there's still going to be this common yardstick that says, how are you doing? And we are still looking at that. And I think, one of the challenges is, even Rick Stiggins, who's very prolific in formative assessment, and I'd love to dig into the formative assessment piece, even Stiggins, who promotes formative assessment so much, says, but there are stakeholders.
Right.
There are school board members.
And talks about balanced assessment.
Yeah, but absolutely balanced, and says those stakeholders need a consistent set of data that lets them know how the groups that they are overseeing, whether it's a state or a district or a school, how they are performing nationally. the question is, how far does the summative piece go? Because what Stiggins would say is, like it or not, we made high stakes testing our school reform model of choice. He says, now, some people will push back on that, some legislators will. He says, well, I'm not talking about what we put in policy, I'm talking about what we funded. Because what we funded was a lot of testing, not necessarily a lot of innovation. So I think it is a reset button, and I think it is a potential. And again, I think your question was, I think the power is going to, another question is, where is it going to rest? Because if it solely rests in the State House, that's not going to change what's going to happen at the school level. But I think this is a reset where we say, okay, we're maybe putting this in check and we're opening up the doors. But again, where does the power fall? Where does it end up?
But there's also something embedded in your question, John. I think that it's not just a reset about the law per se. I think it's a reset about where we are in standards-based reform, right? And so I think the fundamental question becomes, when we're saying we want higher standards, better standards, standards that are comparable, what does that really mean? Because I think we are seeing on a day-to-day basis in schools and classrooms, teachers are trying to sort this out, principals are trying to sort this out. What are the standards we're trying to align to? What are the standards we want to see our students achieve? And I think the reset is as much about who defines the standards and who decides what's good enough. And I kind of feel like that's where, if we work on this together and get it right, the kids win, the teachers win, we get to a better place. But I do think it is too early to tell, because the devil's going to be in the details of how the rules come out and how this gets implemented, and who decides.
And once again, and just to push that point a little bit, and I want to get to Scott, because this is, once again, this would be the argument, which is, hey, we're just going to get 50 different standards. And now you really will have different outcomes by geography, by zip code. And why is that a better thing? I mean, if everyone, and once again, Jim Collins said his vision is that regardless of zip code, race, background, socioeconomic status, you're going to get comparable outcomes. So this could, unintentionally create more differences. I mean, that would be the argument. But Scott.
So I want to come back to standards, but one of the things I wanted to pick up on was the assessment. I think when you look at ESSA, to me, one of the most fundamental, and I think from an optimistic perspective, opportunities we have is around assessment. And I think when you look at the individual states, it's a chance for innovation, to your question of why is it good to have 50 states? Because I think a couple of them will be progressive and say, and this is where I do disagree with the annual assessments, we don't have to have annual assessments. ESSA provides an opportunity for states to waiver out of annual assessments. I envision a day where my kids do not stop learning to take tests, and that we can be smart enough as an industry to say, how do we build in a path for a student that when you have finished a unit, define unit however you want, that Rob has confidence as a superintendent that that student has mastered those objectives and has mastered those standards. And we don't have to stop and take a test to demonstrate that. We can collect it through interactive labs, we can collect it through technology enhanced items, we can collect it through the interaction of that content every day, that we can dashboard out to a confidence where Rob can, as a superintendent, say, this student has mastered these standards. And I can use that as my metric to say that is success. And we can standard that across districts or states. And I think, for me, that's where the true innovation, the true opportunity comes. Because I don't think, even though we say, that 3 through 9 has to be annual, there is the consideration for states to say there is a different way to assess students. And to the extent that we can blend assessment and instruction, I think we all win at that point.
I want to give you a hug.
Don't let us stop you.
I'll give you an amen.
I'll take it.
What we've done is ever since No Child Left Behind, which I do believe No Child Left Behind has done some good, because we went from lip service to really servicing kids who we didn't used to serve before, but we're still not there yet. The mind shift that has to occur is it's not getting kids access to quality education, it's ensuring kids success through quality education. Every one of them, no excuses. Finland has a saying, there's no such thing as student failure, there's only system failure. And until the system ensures the success of every child, we're a failure. And we're only as good as our last learner. And what we've done through the testing regime is that we've taken what's easy to measure and made it important. We need to drop back, flip the model, and decide what's important, and then measure that, and measure our success. And to your point, it does not need to be the annual test. And because we still have that testing requirement for the most part, we're going to continue to have that fear factor in there, because until the teachers see and the principals see that we're not reliant on the test, we're going to continue with this culture that we currently are under. And that scares me, and that's going to inhibit the innovation.
So what's the recommendation? What needs to happen? I mean, we're talking a lot about, yeah, it's new, the legislation has just come out, there's fear factor. So what needs to happen? What's the advice that you would give to your state or to others?
Well, I'll start with what we've done in my current district is we went through the process of a strategic plan. And personally, when you put those two words together, it raises the hair on my neck. But we had a great facilitator that led a really wonderful process last year. 1,200 people came through, and we decided what was best for our kids. 7 lanes. Within that, there's measurable outcomes within each of those goals, or I call them lanes because that's how the community aligns. That's how we measure ourselves. That's what's important to us. And so what are those things? Well, it can be early literacy, it can be math, it can be all the core subject stuff, but also what about those underperforming subgroups? We've taken our 3 lowest performing subgroups and we're deploying resources to those kids who need it the most. And we've got to put our money where our mouth is and put the resources to those kids and ensure their success. You raise the kids who are struggling the most, you raise an entire system. All ships rise with the rising tide. But and I'll finish with this. Right. Student engagement, student voice, parental engagement. We've got to get parents in telling that they're expert on their kids. They've got to be in and engaged in the process and helping us connect the kids to the learning. And we've got to individualize and personalize the learning so that the kids are engaged in the learning.
I want to
go ahead, Gene.
Pick up on something that Scott said, because I'm right with you in terms of the more we can blend assessment and instruction, the better off we are. And we see the openness for states to have some options there. I'll be very honest, I think the answers to how we do that are going to be in a place like this. Because to do that effectively, we're going to need some really dynamic innovation. Point being, the models that I've seen so far are, somebody's doing something that's formative and then we're going to collect that and make that part of summative. It has to be so not transparent, but the teachers don't even have to realize that that's going to become part of the summative piece, because to me, like, one drop of summative taints formative for a lot of people. You can be doing something that's really, really formative, but if the teacher knows that this experience and this point is going to be collected and that factor is going to be part of the summative measure, then it's going to bring all that baggage. For lack of a better term, we need that stealth assessment perspective where kids are being assessed when both kids and teachers don't even realize that they are. When we can innovate to that point, then I think we have a chance to get into what you're talking about, which would be a wonderful place. But my concern is, in the short term, I don't see those models, and I'm afraid what some people may try to do in the name of innovation may become formative assessments that then quickly get tainted with the blood of summative, and then we don't really end up in a much better place.
So each of you, the 3 of you, represent what I think the conference has been calling the leadership track, because you're big. So maybe I'll try to represent all the folks that are in the venture track or the little smaller companies, because if I'm a small company, one of the nice things about having a kind of a national standard and a national set of tests was that it opened up the market for me. And now I didn't have to actually choose one state versus the other to start, and it created an opportunity for me to actually be able to take my innovation and have an easier time of scaling it up. And when this happens, now I may be thinking, geez, I don't have the resources to try to create what you're all talking about for each and every state. Maybe I have to choose a smaller one. It will be very difficult for me to scale. Does that worry you at all, Robert? And then, for each of you, what would you say to that argument, which is, hey, this really advantages the big guys and really hurts the small folks?
I'm going to approach that from 2 angles. First, Oklahoma is a state that adopted Common Core and then reversed that decision, and now developed something that is not supposed to be Common Core, but looks a lot like Common Core.
That's exactly right.
And so what happened, to your point about 50 states, 50 standards, what I found as a superintendent coming to events and talking with solution providers is that all of a sudden, what's been designed and some really cool, innovative products don't necessarily apply. And so that could have an adverse effect as we differentiate around the country.
Right.
But there's another provision in ESSA that's really intriguing, and that's the pay for success portion of it. And basically it's social impact payments. And so the idea is that you get foundations, you get funders to come in and front the money for innovation, initiatives, whatever. You put perhaps a 3-year measurement on it. When successful, then the district or the state or whomever, or perhaps local funders, then pay off the investors. If unsuccessful, then the funders who fronted the money lose out. So it's a no risk for the school district. That could really open up, I think, tremendous market opportunities for companies big and small.
Yeah. First of all, I'm happy to hear that we're considered a big company. Thank you for that.
Bigger, at
bigger.
least.
Okay, that's great. I'll take bigger. I think one of the interesting things that we've seen over the last couple, we developed a digital math resource after Common Core came out, and we had the ability to align it to Common Core. And so we built it around conceptual understanding and procedural fluency and real-world application, which, Common Core or not, was the right thing to do. When we went through the Texas adoption, we changed it. We went through the North Carolina adoption, even though they've adopted Common Core, they did at the time. It's an integrated pathway, so we changed it. Went through the Florida adoption, so on and so forth. So I think one of the misnomers is that digital companies today can really create the Common Core, and it applies everywhere. To Rob's point, Oklahoma's different. Pennsylvania has Common Core, but it's called Pennsylvania Core, which is different. And so we are still today and throughout the past couple of years developing for every state. The good news is everybody teaches the life cycle. Everybody teaches the Pythagorean theorem. Everybody teaches certain content, so you can build units that make sense and make those modular. So my point is I don't know that it really is an advantage or a disadvantage. I think it really is the course of business that we've been going through for the last couple of years. I don't know that it's really changed that much. I mean, the two things I'd point out is the 42 states that have adopted Common Core don't have the same standards, believe it or not. And the states that haven't adopted Common Core still look a lot like those states that have Common Core. And so I think that at the end of the day, you create what you think are great resources that have the right instructional methodology that you believe in. You deliver those to the market, you customize per state. I think the bigger challenges for smaller companies, do you do Pennsylvania state history? Do you do Texas state? I mean, do you go to the granular level, especially in places where you're in an adoption cycle, and really target those kind of state history courses or things that are so specific to one state? But I don't think it's as much of a Common Core issue as people might think it is.
Where are you on this?
Well, I'm in Texas, so you do Texas history. Just kidding. I think,
it's hard not to.
To your point, I mean, the whole politicization of Common Core is amazing. And with the states where it's now an illegal phrase, but as to your point, you get in, you look at the actual standards, and they haven't changed, which then becomes crazy because then you have people that can't even touch a resource that's good for them because it's got a Common Core label somewhere. I think the reality of it is we're much, much, much closer now to more consistent standards across the country. When you look at simultaneously both the Common Core State Standards Initiative and the two assessment consortia, clearly the standards initiative has been far more effective than the two consortia have been.
Right.
So the standards are battered. They've gotten a bad rap. They've gotten some new labels. People are in defensive positions. But there's only been a few folks that kind of really dropped off. Oklahoma's one of them. But I think it's really the assessments that did not make it to the point that we hoped they would make it to the point. So, it fell far, far, far short of being able to achieve.
Yeah,
what
and
we
if you were to put
anticipated.
that together, I mean, if for those of you who have been sitting in on some of these pitch sessions, part of virtually every pitch has been, here's what we do, and here's the change in the test, the test scores. And so I know you said that a hint of summative and a formative assessment is going to kill the creativity, but I mean, that's the nature of a little bit of the business. And to say, Robert says, we're really afraid, we're scared right now because all these things are changing and people are terrified of it. And one way to hold on to reality is to say, here's our test, and if things help with the test, we're okay, we're good. So, to your point, Gene, we have to kind of talk about this together. I mean, we can't really separate out the standards and not how the tests are actually driving those standards and what happens on the ground. And in that world, it seems to me that having all these different, pushing the testing choices to different places would do that.
I
Do you disagree?
But I would argue that maybe the conversation we're having in and of itself is not very innovative, right? It's still very much defined by the constraints of the world as we know it and current reality.
Sure.
And yet ignoring big chunks of current reality. We're now at a point where more than half our kids show up in school coming from households living in poverty. We're more diverse than we ever were before. We're not really dealing with any of those realities in any meaningful way. We're still talking very much, we're talking about the new law with the language and the constraints of No Child Left Behind, right? Which is still where most schools and districts are operating, and frankly, where most of us who are service providers to schools and districts are operating, because that's kind of the current reality. Second thing I would note is when we're talking about innovation, whether it's an ed tech startup or a company like Pearson, what problem are you trying to solve for, right? Because it gets really, really specific, right? Are we talking about an intervention for an English language learner, or are we talking about a statewide English language curriculum, right? And those are really different things. And I just want to sort of caution us that we're kind of talking about all this stuff at a grain size that I'm not sure gets at what you're really dealing with when you're trying to solve for a particular education challenge, no matter what size of service provider you are.
So what's your sense? Does this matter? When
I
you're
would
talking
actually go
about
back to
that?
something Rob said, which is the whole notion of its system failure, right? And I think one of the things we're talking about within our company, literally an hour before I was here, I was having coffee with a colleague of mine, and he kept saying that I still think we're having the innovation conversation as though it's about what's happening in the classroom rather than what's happening around the classroom. Because you can still find practices of teachers or classrooms where really innovative things are happening, but we haven't figured out the ways to sort of sustain and scale them. And a big part of it is the fear piece, but it's also, does the technology really work? Do you really have the sort of support you need? Do we have the infrastructure we need? So I think that's another piece of the innovation conversation, right? Is that it's not just about the teaching and learning in the classroom, but what are the systems in place that prevent system failure?
Do you have a sense at this point whether the new legislation will help, hinder, or it doesn't matter?
I think what the new legislation
with what you're talking about.
No, what I think the new legislation does is set that reset button, right? And I do think it gives us a chance to rethink, again, what's the role of federal, state, and local, and what is the role of service providers. I do think it's too early to tell to see how we're going to go.
Okay.
I want to jump on that quickly. A guy that I really admire and follow the work of is Yun Chao, Dr. Yun Chao, formerly of Michigan State, now he's at the University of Oregon, Chinese raised, born and raised. And he has said from the beginning, you know, his first book was Catching Up or Leading the Way. You know, we're chasing this test score, but you look at what's happening in the Asian countries, they're trying to become more creative and innovative. And they want their kids to be like our kids and be more confident. You know, he laughs about the Asian kids are great at math. They think they aren't, we're not, and we think we are. But he made a really interesting comment in a conversation we had a couple years ago, and that is when he first came out with his anti-test, or warning, I should really say, not anti-test, but how we're using it. He basically said, you know, the superintendents of the day really loved my message, Yun Chao, really loved his message. Superintendents today have built their careers on the test score.
Right.
They don't know any different. And you know, for what it's worth, I'm not afraid. You know, I've never said we're teaching to the test. I've always said we've got to get away from that. We've got to teach kids. But the fear that's in the system and the culture that's built around it's going to take time to undo. So what has got to happen is those of us in positions to do so, whether it be the solution providers, whether it be government, state house, whatever, have got to show that we're unlocking those shackles.
Exactly.
Shilpi has introduced this notion of, you know, this different levels, right? So we're kind of, is it the state, is it at the district, is it at the building level, is it at the classroom level? And what will this legislation allow or promote, incentivize us to do differently in the future than in the past? Where are the two of you on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because Rob said something that made me think. I did a panel yesterday where I was the moderator of Baltimore County Schools. And so Dallas their superintendent was on the panel, but they had a great cross-representation, but they had a teacher on the panel as well. And one of the things Andrea said, second grade teacher, over and over, she said, I feel safe. Like, I feel safe to do things in my classroom that are innovative. You know, I think that the reality is that, from our perspective, that comes with leadership. Right? That becomes from, I don't want to say the top down, but it comes throughout an organization that she is made to feel safe in that classroom, that if she tries something and fails, that she's not going to lose her job for it, or it's not going to be put up on a board anywhere. So I think that, you know, how does that tie back to ESSA? I think the challenge for us and the opportunity for us is how do we bring those accountability measures closer to where we want to be? So, you know, Rob just said, I tell my teachers not to teach to the test, because the hope there is that with that instruction that's taking place, he's doing what's right for those kids, and ultimately they're going to be successful in hitting the materials that they need to hit. So how do we bring that assessment closer to the vision that Rob has for instruction in those classrooms? I think that's the opportunity and the challenge ahead of us.
And something that also has not come up that's also part of the mix is, you know, we had so much activity just recently about tying test scores to educator evaluation.
Right.
And I think that's driven a lot of the fear on the part of teachers, that they felt like if they followed the pacing guide and they did whatever, you know, then it was a safer position there. And again, that goes back to, you know, how is that piece going to be handled? Obviously, within ESSA, there's a lesson requirement around that. So how many of the states who have done that are going to back off of that? The ones that are dealing with, how are they dealing with it? I'm not saying that's necessarily an all bad thing, because I think there are measures. Again, we have stakeholders that need pieces of information. But teachers are more demoralized now than I've ever seen. You know, as a third generation educator with a fourth generation in the family, I cannot believe the low level of morale from my family members and my former colleagues back at school. You know, here we are having a conversation about innovation, and I don't think they think of themselves as being allowed to be innovators. So there's a lot of cultural pieces that we have to change around that. What's interesting too is, you know, a couple of folks, when we were preparing for this, I was chatting with folks, they went right to innovation around assessment, which we've kind of done as well.
Right.
But the actual title is about innovation.
That's why I said
period.
we're still constraining the conversation.
What's going to happen with innovation under ESSA? Back to your first question, I feel better about this because I think there's more openness around this piece of legislation than we had before. But again, there's some deep cultural constructs and a lot of resonant or remnant fear from what has been most recently to, again, think that we can, you know, flip a switch and then everybody's going to feel free to innovate. I think we need a lot of leadership conversations about how do we make it safe. How do you create a teacher that says, I feel safe to do that? And that's
kind of a risk-taking, you know, culture about
where
trying
that's
different
okay.
things and where that's okay.
And I think the more that we can get the power and the abilities down to the school and classroom level, probably the better off. I mean, if the states take the ball and then they design everything and then that gets rolled out statewide, that's not a rich soil for innovation. To me, it's when folks at the grassroots level the shackles are off, as you said.
I want to combine your two comments and come back to what Scott said about leaders. I banned pacing guides in my district. And now our curriculum department, they were really thrilled to hear that after they spent all that time developing them. But you can't individualize and personalize learning when you're following pacing guides, because basically one size fits maybe one, probably none. And so you've got to be able to break teachers free from that. So what they're now doing is developing monthly unit designs and giving that flexibility within the curriculum. And so the idea is that the innovation is going to come from the classroom. We've got to get these teachers free to look at each child with a name, a strength, a need, a hope, and a dream, and connect the learning to it.
How does that also change how you're asking your teachers to work, whether as teams or as groups, right? Because that's also another notion of innovation, just a very simple one outside of technologies, that we've traditionally had teachers kind of isolated in their classrooms by themselves. I'd be curious how you're kind of approaching that piece of it.
Well, it kind of comes back to the assessment question in this form, that we've got to develop authentic mixed methods of assessment. And so what we're doing is we're getting a rich data set of measurements, of metrics that we're looking at each child. And then the teachers putting them into situations where they can talk about what it is that's working for these kids. I'll give you an example that's adult focused, but it was an absolute huge shift in my previous district when we're having a conversation about how do we really drill down. And an example was, we had instructional coaches. We're going through budget cuts. All the input was get rid of the instructional coaches and protect class size. Well, I kept them, but they still weren't very effective, and they were an opt-in model. So basically, if you're coming to help me, I have a stigma as being a bad teacher. Here's the shift. Now you, as an instructional coach, are helping me as a teacher reach John. Here's what I know about John. Here's what makes him tick. Here's some strategies to help you reach John. That is a huge paradigm shift in and of itself. That was one of those moments where I just went, I can't believe it took me 20 years to think of that.
Right. Well, so we have only about 9 minutes left, and what I wanted to do is give each of you just to wrap up our session with a closing thought about this. And if you had to, I'll give you a topic, and if you want to choose a different topic, that's fine. But the question that I would have for you is, it is early to tell, too early to tell. And we've talked a lot about the contextual aspects of what this legislation has been rolled out into, this last 10 years and what that has looked like, and what is possible given all the innovative technology and services that are being rolled out. If you were providing some advice to the folks in the room who may be starting companies, running companies, thinking about running companies, how would you characterize the way they should look at this legislation and what they should do differently going forward? How important is this legislation for them? Is it, on one end, ignore it? It's one of those things you can't control anyway. Focus on the classroom and what happens with adults, kids, learning, innovation. Or is this on the other end, which is, man, make this your North Star and make sure you're aligned to it. And where are you on this? What's the advice? Scott, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so largely I'd be the latter. I wouldn't say ignore it. I'd say understand the nuances. But Rob talked about taking the shackles off. I mean, I think fundamentally, I think we know a lot about teaching and learning. I think we know a lot in this country about great instructional practice. I think each of us can talk about a classroom we walk in where the needs of every child academically is being met. I think the question that we ask ourselves constantly and that people in the room starting companies should ask themselves is, how do we take those tools and technologies and those resources that we have available to us today that did not exist 5 years ago and support what we know about great instructional practice and do that at scale, right? So how do we take those pockets of success, those great classrooms, how do we do it systematically, organizationally, and at scale?
Okay.
Somewhat very close to it because you just triggered something in my mind. But something you said before when we were talking about which standard set. You said if someone's got a product that's good and kids respond to it and teachers see it, a lot of times the alignment conversation doesn't even come up because let's face it, math is math, reading is reading. Whether you're in Oklahoma or Texas or there's a lot of variance there. But I want to hit two things. US DOE years ago gave a model for defining innovation. So you start with the baseline. That's where you are. If a bunch of people start doing something, you might have a trend on your hand. Doesn't mean they were doing something great, just means they were doing it. On the other end, you've got some people that are doing something that's really meaningful, but it doesn't reach scale. That's an innovation. That's an invention. Innovation is when we actually get something to scale that is substantially impactful. It reaches scale and improves on the status quo. So, what interests me the most is how are we going to innovate around getting to the stealth or invisible assessment piece where information is being collected on kids, but it's not that traumatic experience of sitting for a week for the state test. But then also getting, again, down to the teacher level and letting them feel that they are free to innovate because the answers are there. I've seen plenty of groups here that have risen up from teachers with great ideas. Was in a session the other day with Teachers Pay Teachers. Phenomenal spirit around teachers, creating the answers, and we've got to do all that we can to foster that.
Okay.
So I would actually say don't start with thinking about the law. I'd also say don't start by listening to any of us other than Rob. Because I think that the piece here really is, and I get trapped in it as much as anybody in who works in education. I think the frame of talking about scalability has gotten us into way more trouble than it's helped us. And I think that, I remember being in, early in my career, did a lot of work in research and did a whole bunch of evaluations of NSF-funded projects to try to drive innovation and figure out what we could scale. And I think the language of scale gets us to assessments and standardization and comparability and thinking that the way you scale is rolling out 10 Lizzies that all look the same. And I think if we've learned anything in 25 years of education reform work, is that you can't differentiate and personalize if you're then trying to make everybody the same, right? So I think the real innovation and what I'm hoping the folks here and the inventors and some of the researchers and young interns who work with us will help us figure out is how do we actually solve that tension between there is a high kind of level of achievement and opportunity that we want to make sure is comparable and available, but we also want to get to that point so personalized and individual and different for every kid and for every teacher, right? 2 teachers can get really great results but teach in really different ways. How do we make that real?
Personalizing at scale, maybe that's,
Or think about it more in terms of in addition to Yun Chao, who I love and have done a lot of work with, learn from, Luis Gomez talks about this a lot, about I think we want to get into the mindset of is what can go viral and replicate, right? So that the essential element stays the same, but the piece that needs to be different and adapt does. And I think, again, I'm going to caution all of us that we're stuck in a language that's holding us back.
Sure. Robert, you have the last word here.
I love having last word. First of all, we've got to quit treating educators in education like it's a gladiator sport. And by that, people who do try and step out, who are trying to be creative and innovative, get bludgeoned because it's different than what the community knows or knew before or what we did when we went to school type of thing. Secondly, that we've got to celebrate failure. We've got to have people out there pushing the boundaries and trying new things. And when we fail, great, what did we learn? Let's move on, but fail fast. And thirdly, I really believe, and using Jim Collins, that technology is the accelerator. So what tools can we put into teachers' hands to allow them to truly differentiate the learning? That's a word we've been throwing around for a bajillion years, but then we give them pacing guides. So what we've got to do is give them tools so that they can drill down and really bring learning to life for these kids and make it something that excites them. I mean, I have 6 children of my own, and they're all so very different. But except for one thing, they all hate school because it's so damn boring.
Well, let me just wrap up by saying that, in this very brief exchange of ideas that we've really touched on a lot of issues around culture and what's been there. And I think one thing that has come out clearly is that the legislation has had many intended consequences, and maybe one of the unintended consequences is creating this sense of compliance, fear, and not devoid of this notion of failure as a way to learn as opposed to failure in itself. And that is going to outlive the change in legislation, and that's something that we all have to be aware of and focused on. The second, I think, that came out was the notion of thinking about where innovation needs to happen. Where are the front lines now? If it's no longer at the kind of the central government, federal government, state, district, school, classroom, other levels, maybe it's at the home, whatever, but really thinking about where innovation needs to happen and how that happens. And as the partnership between school district and service providers, thinking about what are the new ways in which we should be working together. What are some new paradigms that we should be thinking about as a way to support that? But a caution at the same time, and I think Shilpi, you said it a couple times, this caution of, hey, we can't apply our old framework into the new world. And then I guess my own personal caution is that variation in itself is not necessarily innovation and not necessarily better. It's just variation. Yeah. And you guys have been terrific panelists. Please join me in thanking them.